that should not happen, and collective rights, that should not happen. And it's not that these rights are enforceable. It's almost impossible to enforce a right against a very complex intelligence agency. Intelligence agencies, by definition, are engaged in work that is about the secret collection of information. And in most countries, unfortunately, by definition, are engaged in secretive work also because they are there to break the law, to do things outside the law. So the notion that we are going to stop the behavior of organizations like the NSA with laws or with rights is completely fanciful. But nonetheless, for human beings to have that concept within themselves that this is something that human beings should not be susceptible to, I think is something that we can work with and build upon. And I want to harken back to surveillance in Czech Republic and under the Stasi. Of course, initially, you had technical people and, if you like, political nerds of surveillance that went and understood what were the ways of recruiting informers, how could you tell if someone was an informer, what sort of hidden microphones are there, how are you tailed, how do you check for tails, etc. And based on that technical understanding, then political understandings of the nature of a surveillance society developed. At the moment, we are in an early stage. We are at this stage where the nerds of surveillance, the people operating, if you like, on our side, on the public side, are trying to understand what is the technical reality, or simply what is the reality of the mass surveillance that is occurring. And then we need to transition from this into some cultural understanding of the dangers of heading towards an international mass surveillance society.
Okay, another question. Thank you.
Hi. My question is, would you say this is a way of the US try to reaffirm itself as the world's greatest superpower?
What way? What is the way?
Political power, the pursuit of political power in the international system.
I don't know about reaffirm. It's been affirming that for quite a long time. I think it's just, you know, if you know the history of the National Security Agency, you can go back to an article that we republished from Ramparts magazine, originally printed in 1973. If you just go to search.wikileaks.org and you can just search for NSA Ramparts, R-A-M-P-R-T-S. That the National Security Agency has been involved in this sort of business for a long time. It was a massive scandal in the 70s. It came out, there was inquiries with the Church Committee in Congress. The National Security Agency had been scanning emails and, you know, engaging in domestic spying, including of activists. And that history has now been largely forgotten because, you know, there were vested interests in the United States that didn't want to keep retelling and repeating that history. And also, that original whistleblower in 1973 was so far ahead of his time that many people didn't believe what was going on. So it's a natural progression. The difference is the internet has pulled every society into that surveillance matrix, and nearly every single human being and every single human being who has any ability to influence anything, because they're all on the internet. So there's an exponential increase in the grasp of the National Security Agency and thereby the United States and, more broadly speaking, the Anglo-Saxon powers. But I think it's just a long, hungry development for power combined with this phenomenon of all the other societies entering into a system where they can be easily surveilled.
It's interesting because you haven't seen the Chomsky interview we showed, but he has the same thinking. He goes through 100 years ago from the Philippines occupation by the US and says that we're just extending these means that were used 100 years ago, and that it's been progressively extending, and there is nothing new about it. And so, as you might guess, of course, for him, you are quite a hero of the contemporary term, and in a way, your status of public enemy reminds him a bit of his 40 years ago. And so the first question, just to let you know, the first question he asked us, and it's on film, so you'll see it, when we went to see him, is how is he? Is he holding on? How is he going to keep on doing? And and we have to help him. So that was just a side point. Okay, can we have another question?
Hi, Julian. I'm Ana Gomez. I'm a member of the European Parliament.
Can you speak closer to the microphone?
I'm a member of the European Parliament. One of the people who welcomed WikiLeaks and the revelations about what we are trying to establish, the complicity of European governments with the US government on the torture program, so-called the extraordinary rendition. And of course, I'm one of the people who think yet you're not a criminal. And that welcomes also the revelations that Edward Snowden and others have brought to us. At the same time, as a member of the European Parliament and having to indeed consider all what is at stake, I have to consider as well security concerns of our societies. Unfortunately, we do not live in a beautiful world where one can clearly distinguish a line between the criminals and the non-criminals. And sometimes, as we've seen by the revelations of WikiLeaks, we have criminals inside governments, inside security agencies.
Many.
Exactly. So my question is, the privacy rights have never been absolute rights, especially when it comes about fighting criminality. Of course, there are intrusions that are lawful according to certain rules. Do you think that, for instance, a tool like Tor, on one hand, indeed provides free software to people who want to defend themselves and, against the criminality, namely from security agencies, governmental ones. But on the other hand, to what extent is this also not needing, in order to survive, indeed governance, so that indeed the rights to privacy will not be abused and put at the service of organized crime, terrorist networks, and so on? Thank you.
Well, I have two answers for this. First of all, if we're talking about security, what is the really big threat to security? The really big threat to security is intelligence agencies getting too much power. And as a result, creating a state or collaborating with another state in order to subjugate the domestic population in one way or another. It doesn't have to be this classical form of subjugation, say in Hungary, or Russian tanks roll into Czech Republic. It can be a more sophisticated, modern form of subjugation, which is about which industries get what amount of money, trade deals, foreign investment, buying up your industries and your land. So we're in a much more fluid form of subjugation than we used to be. So that's actually the biggest security threat for any society, is that the society goes bad. And then nearly every single member in the society is affected. Sometimes even the elite in the society are affected because it seems like there's no escaping it. Secondly, this question about, okay, it's true, Tor can be used for all sorts of bad things. I think the majority use of Tor is probably for people in Iran and China to read the BBC or some propaganda websites in the West, or actual dissidents' websites. I think that's the majority use. The second use case is probably people wanting to look at perfectly harmless pornography, but being concerned that their work might have a problem with it. And then, of course, there's plenty of criminal uses as well. But I answer this question not by saying, well, states and governments are inherently completely illegitimate. They have a role to protect people from victimization, and it's an important role. I answer it by going, well, did we have mass surveillance 20 years ago? No. And were criminals running amok, destroying, tearing up society 20 years ago? No. So in setting this threshold, answering this question, do we need mass surveillance in order to have a civil society where criminals aren't tearing up the streets? We have the answer. The answer is no. And therefore, we are pushing over that. We're pushing over that into a more controlling regime. And this controlling regime will lead to conformity and people being scared to speak. And at its worst, can lead to subjugation of the democratic process within a state.
Jake wants to react also. 1 second.
That's a tough act to follow, Julian. But as a Tor person, I would like to extend another point, which is you say that the right to privacy is not absolute. I think that this framing is not the correct framing, and I would suggest something here, which is that the right for someone, that is to say an intelligence agency, to interfere in my life, it's actually not an absolute right. We specifically say that for someone to interfere, for example, to violate your right in some way, or to limit your rights in some way, that there needs to be, in the United States or in Europe, there needs to be a specific reason. Now, the notion of mass surveillance is that the reason is not specific, but rather general. And in fact, that right to absolutely resist general warrants is encoded in the American and in certain parts of the European system, though not in the British part of the European system for obvious historical reasons. But it is important to understand that we do have a right, in fact, to send each other letters where these spies cannot and should not be able to, and where lawful law enforcement agencies should not be able to open it without a particularized suspicion. Mass surveillance goes against this, and it says that we no longer need particularized suspicion. And furthermore, this notion of framing it as privacy is incorrect. What we are speaking about is liberty itself, and what we are saying is that spies get to subvert our liberty at their desire without particularized suspicion. And then they say it is to protect us. And so finally, to follow up with that, what I would say is the Iraq War is an example of what happens with mass surveillance. We killed somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million people, and we did that with the NSA's help. We spied on that country, we bombed that country, we targeted people, we killed them. This happened with the help of surveillance, mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. When people say that surveillance reduces terrorism, they forget to tell you that it also increases the efficiency of war, but it does not necessarily ensure that it will be a perfect war, as you know by the number of civilians that are dead. So if we look at the total number of bodies, mass surveillance seems to pile them up even higher than terrorism, in my mind. And as we look throughout time, what we will see is that surveillance is control, and sometimes that control is asserted through violence. And it is states that do it, not just asymmetric so-called terrorists. General Alexander is definitely and has waged more violence on the world, that is the former director of the NSA, than Al-Qaeda ever has. Because he waged wars against entire nations using mass surveillance. So this question, do you have a right? Yes, you have a right to be autonomous. You have a right to have a European Union that is not under surveillance, that is not captured. And I have a right as an individual to be free from that kind of a control from the very start, especially when I am not a criminal to begin with. And in fact, in a network society, without anonymity, you will not have whistleblowing. You will not have the ability to securely communicate in a way that is not tampered with. And as a result, you will not be free. So to choose anonymity, to choose things like Tor, even though police officers that commit acts of police brutality may also use it, it is to choose to be free by default and to know that it will be hard for those spies to do their job, which is exactly how it should be.
We're not launch. There is the European Parliament for that. Maybe we will have a session.
Can I want to add very little something.
No,
It's even harder to go after Julian and Jake on the issue, and I'll try not to. But when you talk about security, you talk about risk analysis. And some of what Julian said earlier, we know that mass surveillance was used to spy upon all the employees of Petrobras in Brazil. So this capacity gives the US the ability to destabilize major economic operators, which means destabilizing whole economies. And we know particularly here what it means when the whole economy of a country is destabilized and open for auctioning to private interests. So this power is probably a much bigger risk for Brazil than any type of terrorist attacks. But what it means inherently is two different security models, or rather one security and one anti-security model. Because to enable this mass surveillance in the name of fighting terrorism, we see that all of technology got subverted in the hands of a very few actors, and the result is this total imbalance of power and this potential for control by very few actors, when on the other hand, what we do when we become autonomous in controlling technology by ourselves is distributing the power, distributing the security in order to guarantee that it will not be overly concentrated in the hands of a few. This is a way better security model for society than the anti-security model of the technology for control.
We'll take another question. Can you rise, please? Thank you.
It's very inspiring to hear your conviction that we can continue to live without fear in a surveilled world. Can you comment on how you are able to continue working in the constraints of the embassy, and how you are facing the constraints on your own freedom and on your own rights, how you practically continue to do this work?
When I was speaking about the cultural changes that must come about in relation to our own self-perception of how we as human beings and as cultures deal with mass surveillance. We can look at the sort of the double entendres or dog whistling or subversion of cultural products in the former East, where you have people, okay, they're surveilled. You even have this phenomenon, well, even in the West now quite often, with cultural products that are made for the public consumption, which is you encode multiple messages in them. You encode things in such a way that the audience that you want to speak to can understand it, but grunts that work for the National Security Agency can't understand it. And that's a cultural adaptation to mass surveillance. How do I deal with it? Well, I'm in a different position to other people. While I have surveillance up close and personal, Edward Snowden documents showed that GCHQ has been spying on us, and that I was put onto an NSA man-hunting list, that's what the NSA called it, from early as 2010. And of course, there's $10 million in the last 2 years, according to the UK government's own records, has been spent on the police outside the embassy, just the policing operation. $15,000 every day is spent surveilling me here. So it's, and my guests who come in and out, of course, there's intelligence operations against them. So it is really very, extremely personal for me. But I have the luxury, unlike most people, of having a background in cryptography and how to deal with surveillance. So I wouldn't like to say that my experience is directly transferable onto other people. I have, yes, much, much greater interest than the average person. On the other hand, with mass surveillance, everyone is sucked up into it. But I also have a lot of training about how to actually deal with it. How I do actually deal with it, well, to deal with it, unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly how we deal with it, because then perhaps it wouldn't work anymore. But as a sort of simple description, it's really the key is understanding what's important and what is not important, and how to, if you like, to confuse the opponent with what's not important, and spend the effort on those things which are truly important. And that's a hard thing to do, to understand what needs a lot of work to protect, and on the other hand, what might be good to confuse your opponent in revealing it.
So another question, please.
Are you preparing another spy files release? And if yes, can you tell us a bit?
We are. I can't tell you much because, well, I would like to say because it's all super secret, but the real answer to this question is because I've delegated that to someone else in the organization. But I understand, yes, another spy files release is being prepared.
Bom dia, chamo Graça. Eu queria agradecer o fantástico trabalho, mas também dizer que há muita gente que não está na situação que está o Julian, mas há muitas pessoas que deixaram, por exemplo, desligaram do sistema. Há muita gente, por exemplo, eu deixei de dar aulas no momento em que percebi que a escola está a formatar as crianças e está a contribuir para uma escola do horror completo. Portanto, o que eu acho fantástico é que o cinema, a arte como forma de conhecimento, nós já vimos tudo, nós vimos o 1984 e nós já estamos. Na realidade, nós estamos num mundo ainda em que temos muitas camadas. Agora, eu não me parece que possamos sair daqui, e a pergunta era esta, se nós podemos sair daqui sem haver uma mudança interior. Cada um numa mudança individual. Eu acho que estes 2 dias de conversa, nós ficamos muito angustiados porque é tudo a nível macro. Como é que eu reajo? Eu tenho os pés no chão, eu só posso agir aqui. Como é que eu ajo a nível macro? Parece-me que esta percepção da vigilância de massas é um problema, é um pormenor de um problema muito maior, que tem a ver com o facto de nós, a nossa dimensão ética estar reduzida a zero. Quando nós vemos o Edward Snowden...
Pode acortar para ter a pergunta para poder...
O que eu quero perguntar é se, na verdade, acha que podemos ganhar esta batalha sem haver uma mudança interior, sem cada um de nós, ou a maior parte da humanidade, fazer uma escolha em termos da humanidade, da defesa da dimensão ética que define o homem.
So the question is, do you think we can win this fight and enter into this fight without first having an inner change and having an ethical change inside us before entering into these political struggles from technical and other ways?
It's an old question in politics. If suddenly, we all just became Buddhists, would that fix the problem that we have? Well, I think you can look at Hirohito's Japan to find the answer to that question. Japan in the lead up to World War II. You can have everyone being a Buddhist, and you can also have a perfectly fascist state. Human beings in politics are very adaptable. They can recontextualize anything. So right thinking and right action, principles from Buddhism, can be adapted to you should become a kamikaze pilot. Be brave enough to do it and to do it. And so I think that the answer is no, it's not spiritual change from within. Rather, the answer is both these phenomena together, because spiritual change or change in character must be based on something. It's worthless if it comes from nothing at all, if it comes from just a few words. It has to be based on an understanding of what the environment actually is, and seeing other people in that environment and learning to be compassionate about their suffering, but then also experiencing it yourself, going out of your way to act in what some people would call a courageous manner, but which is really just checking your understanding of the environment. As I said before, that all that is necessary for empirical domination or the domination of an intelligence agency or some nasty little fascist company is just that other people are scared of it. It's the perception of fear is all that is necessary. It can be completely illusory, the actual ability to do anything. You have Hollywood, for example, constantly pumping out absurd movies showing the US military as this incredibly competent machine, or the CIA agents as incredibly competent people. They are extremely incompetent people. Why are they so incompetent? Because secrecy breeds incompetence. When mistakes go wrong, they can't be fixed. Security contractors, for example. I think, okay, well, what about, there's the privatization of intelligence now. Maybe that means actually you get the normal competence you would get from private industry and then feeding into these government apparatuses. That's a problem, no? But the reality is those security companies are also incredibly incompetent because the fruits of their labor, of their contracts, are secret. So when, people looking at the histories of companies and did they produce quality intelligence products and how robust they are, a lot of that is obscured by secrecy. So that they just simply take money from the government and give it to their friends, which is what most of these defense contractors do, is hard for the governments to understand. And then the majority of the relationships that are occurred. You look at what happened to General Alexander. What's he done? He's gone and become a military contractor. All these people become military contractors. Why did they become military contractors? Because they're good at starting businesses? They've never started businesses. Because they're good at running businesses? They've never run a business. They do it because they have personal contacts inside government. And with those personal contacts is how they get their contracts. So they get their contracts not as a result of producing powerful quality products, but as a result of personal connections. And that's great. That's fantastic, because it's the built-in incompetence of secrecy, and we can really use that.
We'll take maybe two last questions if you still have 5 minutes for us.
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Anna. I'm just a concerned citizen. I'm not an expert in anything. I was just, it happened to me that I tried to give a smartphone to my teenage son, but he's smarter than me and he refused it. And I decided to take it to myself. And I was very happy with it because it was indeed very smart until I realized that I was really a fly in the web. But when I discussed this with some friends, they said that they weren't concerned because they thought that, in fact, this was the way of the market being more targeted to people. So we were all targeted, and so the market could direct products more efficiently to each of us. And so the thing is, I agree, not exactly with the other lady, but I think that some paradigm has to change in order for each of us to decide not to be a pawn in this system, because the problem is with the system, and the system was created by us, not by aliens. I don't know exactly if you can comment on this, because I think the problem is us, each of us being willing to be a pawn in the system. Thank you.
I agree. First of all, you should read an essay that is on WikiLeaks called "Google is not what it seems." You can even Google for that if you like. Google is not what it seems. And get them to read that, and they'll understand that when they're interacting with an organization like Google, it's not about simply better targeting of ads. in relation to the better targeting of ads, I agree, that's fine. I'm not bothered about the advertisers too much and the targeting of advertising. But Google is a company that is grown up and become very interconnected with US foreign policy, the US State Department. The last 3 quarters of this year, it has become also the #1 spender in Washington for a company in terms of government lobbying. More than Northrop Grumman, more than Lockheed, more than Raytheon, more than Apple. And it's very ambitious. Its ambitions are not just what it sees as a useful relationship with the US government, but it wants to invade every corner of the world, suck up every single person into its mesh, understand where every person is, what everything looks like, what everyone is doing at any one point in time. And of course, it says it wants to know all these things so it can better target advertising at you. Even if that was true, even if that was the only reason Google was doing this stuff, the fact is that its model, its basic model, is exactly the same as the National Security Agency. Collect as much information about the whole world and every single person in it and what they're doing, store it, index it, produce a predictive model of each person and each organization, and then, if you believe the rhetoric, use that to target advertising. But the reality is Google is in the United States, and it has relationships with the US government. So what happens is the US intelligence agencies then just stick their fangs into Google. So Google is the greatest intelligence coup that has ever happened in this, that has ever happened at all in the world. That people have voluntarily entered into that system. Now, this reminds me that, the basic argument against this kind of stuff is people say, well, I'm not an important person. I've got nothing to hide. And your response to that should be 2 things. First of all, well, what's wrong with you that you have nothing to hide? You must be an incredibly boring person. You're not contributing to the development of our civilization in any way whatsoever. Why would I ever want to talk to you again if you have nothing to hide? Please, immediately go out and get something to hide. The other aspect is that we're all connected together. So our communication travels through each other. We're all friends of each other, directly or indirectly. Everyone is being targeted with mass surveillance, so everyone is actually a target. No one escapes this if they use the internet. But someone reporting on Facebook about you, or stuffing their search terms into Google, or using Gmail to receive your email, they are being informants on you. They are being informants on their relatives, on their husbands, on their wives. They are being informants. That's the reality. And even if they think that they're not very interesting at the moment, their friends may well be, or they may become so, or they may become embroiled in some administrative injustice soon enough. The reality is, as intelligence agencies become more powerful and more secretive, and the organizations connected to them also become more powerful, and the general phenomenon of powerful corporations and individuals getting more power and everyone else getting poorer increases, they become more arbitrary. They become more arbitrary because they are more powerful. And there's no ability for anyone to escape arbitrary injustice. It comes down like lightning on any person. It doesn't matter if you're boring. It doesn't matter if you've kept a clean nose. Look at General Petraeus, the head of the CIA. The head of the CIA, the ultimate insider, thought he was immune from all of this because he's so much in the system. But a constellation of random circumstances meant that he was destroyed. That lightning can strike anyone when you have a system of arbitrary injustice.
Thank you very much, Julian. Maybe a last question, and we'll free you.
Hello, Julian.
Oh, wait. This is becoming a bit anarchical.
Considering the situation that we live now of secrecies and control that seem to be pervasive, if you can project yourself to 60 years ahead, how do you see then the evolution of our Western civilization in this domain? Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think, unfortunately, I would like to say we need to look 60 years ahead. It may, in fact, this phenomenon, I think, will solidify in about 20 years, maybe even 15. And here's the really interesting philosophical question. Is the advancement of civilization in terms of more and more complex technology inherently leading to totalitarianism as a result of inherently leading to centralization? That's the real question that has to be answered. Because when you're dealing with things like semiconductor manufacturers, there's only two that are making most of the chips that are, most of the big chips inside your computers. And they're both in the United States. And why there are only two? Because it's extremely sophisticated, complex process, and once you make a chip, you can ship it around the world. It doesn't go off like an apple or like milk. So you can ship it around the world. You can sell it in one country just as well as you can sell it in another country. It doesn't decay en route. And so globalization for those things that don't tend to decay tends to result in there being one market leader, one secondary company, and then some bespoke operators, so people who make custom solutions for those first two. And we can see that happening, for example, in operating systems, where you have Microsoft, Apple, and then maybe a few others taking up nearly all the market. Search engines, Google taking up, in the West, about 80% of the market, and some countries like Sweden as high as 97%. And just very few other operators. And why? Because it's a global market as a result of the internet. Centralization increases efficiency, in the case of something like Google. So are we heading into a situation as a result of technology advancement of worldwide centralization? And if so, how are we going to stop that equaling totalitarianism? Because once you have a centralization of key features, including, say, the interaction of people over the internet or something like Google, where individuals in all sorts of different states are enmeshed in that system, then whoever can physically dominate it or financially dominate it can control it. On the other hand, is there some tendency about the advancement of technology that is moving into decentralization? Well, technology goes through phases of invention, some spread, centralization, increasing centralization, and then democratization. As more and more people know how to make the technology, it becomes more and more copyable, etc. Now, that traditional route of technology, which has, if you like, its totalitarian phases and its democratic phases, may be undone by the internet. Because now we have something called software as service. Whereas previously, software is something you got on your machine, different manufacturers could make it, different software producers could make it. As more and more became understood about it, more and more people could make it. That's the democratization phase of technology. What we have now, thanks, if you like, to the internet, is software as service. That means, you don't buy the software. In fact, you use servers run by Google or Amazon or Apple or whatever, and you never control it yourself, as Jeremy was speaking about. The result of that means that just one company can serve the world very easily. So I'm not sure. I think we should look to see whether we can find processes that have to do with the globalization of telecommunications that are moving in a different direction. There are just a few that we see. Cryptography, for example, allows you to use the internet, but somehow not use the internet, to create your own network on top of the internet. So the internet may be surveilled, but you can create another network on top. You can create, if you like, a mini state. If you consider a state as something which is able to control itself, and others are not permitted to control it. It has a monopoly on the use of coercive force. Cryptography is a bit like the ultimate air defense system. You know, it's like an S-300 or S-400 air defense system. It keeps coercive force out because it doesn't matter how powerful the state, it cannot break a mass problem. Superpower cannot break a mass problem. It cannot break cryptography. You can create, even if the internet gets completely owned and dominated, you can create your own little internet or state within a state on the internet. Things like Bitcoin, it's a decentralized technologies, but still globalized. It creates relationships or rules of interaction between people which are enforced without using traditional notions of coercive force. So there are a few, but there are not many. So that's why I think we really have to try and find these other mechanisms. Because if we don't find these other mechanisms and technology advances in the direction that it has been advancing, then it seems somehow inevitable that we'll end up in a globalized civilization with very few power centers. And as a result, we will, in essence, be living in a digital totalitarian world.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Good.